The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Right now on the Spin-off Podcast Network, Glenn Kine joins Duncan Grieve on The Fold to discuss Budget 2025 for the media and the Herald's new morning show. On Business is Boring, Simon Pound talks to Sophie Hallwright from The Curve about their mission to help democratise investing for women around the world. Mary Jo Vergara from KiwiBank unpacks this week's monetary policy statement with Bernard Hickey on When the Facts Change. And we launch Fury of the Small, a narrative Dungeons & Dragons podcast that's part radio drama, part adventure novel, and part improv comedy.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to Gone by Lunchtime, a podcast. I'm Toby Manhire. With me here, Annabelle Mather. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Ben Thomas, kia ora. Te Ahi Butler, kia ora.
Kia ora.
You've been working on a D&D podcast lately, which is now a quick plug on the D&D podcast.
Fury of the Small, incredible narrative, immersive, sound designed, amazing voice actors podcast. Listen to it now. Spin-off podcast.
Produced by Te Ahi Butler, so it'll be magic. It's the 4th of June. It's a Wednesday, and very happily we had a long weekend just completed. It was a long weekend, I believe, to mark the transfer of power of the Deputy Prime Minister. I think that was why.
It was the King's birthday.
Oh, was it?
It was the birth of the new king.
Oh, the birth of the new political king.
It was also
David Seymour.
They had a ceremony at Government House.
Yeah,
and the Governor General sort of dowed His Royal Highness David Seymour with a scimitar or something. And
that's right. It was,
it's like,
he was reborn as.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a real renewal of the brand of Deputy Prime Minister, which constitutionally means nothing, but now is becoming quite the occasion.
David Seymour did take the opportunity to have a celebratory breakfast. It was promoted as the incoming Deputy Prime Minister will speak at an event to mark the new Deputy Prime Minister David Seymour. People can new Deputy Prime Minister David Seymour will take questions, and everyone will have an opportunity to engage with the new Deputy Prime Minister David Seymour. But to be clear, this event is not about David Seymour being the Deputy Prime Minister. Not for a moment. Did you do anything to mark the occasion, Annabelle?
actually my Aotearoa Daisy turned 16.
Oh,
so we went to
Wendy's.
It was. We went to Wendy's to celebrate her choice. No, I didn't, but I did watch John Campbell's interview with David Seymour, which was very prickly and bristly and interesting. Yeah, I recommend people watching it. But one of the things that he said that I thought was really interesting in it is, after hearing so much about Luxon's negotiation skills during the election, Seymour said that what his strategy was is he literally read that book, the negotiation book,
The Deal by Donald Trump?
No, Don't Split the Difference. Oh. That's literally what he relied on to coach him through the coalition deal, and look what he walked away with.
That's interesting.
Pretty remarkable, I thought.
He got some big rocks. He moved some big rocks.
A lot of big rocks in there.
Did you do anything to celebrate the arrival of the new Deputy Prime Minister King, Ben?
Yeah, just a bit of a sort of casual get-together, just with a few of my friends, about a dozen of my friends. We all just met in the Epsom electorate around a stone altar.
Yes.
We were wearing robes just because, the weekend we wanted to feel free and light. And
yes.
So we placed a dove on the altar, started chanting ceremonially. Then the dove took flight. The moon turned blood red. yeah, it was just a nice day with friends.
I
And
wish
you-
you'd
you-
invited me. I would have come to that.
I was there.
Oh, you
We
were?
took turns. We took turns reading chapters from the seminal David Seymour text "Own Your Future: A Liberal Vision for New Zealand" in 2017, and then we sacrificed a goat at sunrise. It was beautiful.
I prefer his classic "Birth of a Boom,"
Birth of
the
a Boom.
golden dawn of the Saskatchewan economy. myself.
That's. I mean, another classic. That's really for the deep stands. That one. Congratulations to David Seymour on taking on the role of Deputy Prime Minister. We've had a bunch of stuff emerge around this kind of halfway point in the election cycle, the changeover, the ceremonial thing being the big one. But also we've been given, as you mentioned, Annabelle, various interviews to consume and enjoy. And in the last few hours, two polls. Two
polls.
Opinion polls, which is not the same as an election, I should stress. They're different. They're surveys of opinion and sort of, a glimpse of where we are at halfway point. They're kind of slightly different in terms of what they tell us. The One News Varian poll had National down 2 on 34, Labour down 3 on 29, the Greens up 2 on 12, ACT down 1 on 8, New Zealand First up 1 on 8, Te Pāti Māori up 1 on 4. And that would, if mapped onto an election, which it's not, it would mean that you would have the centre-right coalition returning to power. And then this morning we had an RNZ Reid Research poll arrive, and that suggested that by a very fine margin, even finer margin, a centre-left coalition, that is one that would assemble Labour, the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, could come to power. It had National down 2.2 to 30.7, Labour up 0.9 to 33.2, Greens 1.6 up to 11.6, Te Pāti Māori 0.5 up to 5-ish, ACT down 2.8 to 6.6, New Zealand First up 1.9 to 9.1%. Looking for trends in this, one of them is New Zealand First are the ones that can be most happy with it. If you compare the sort of average numbers across compared to the election of 2023, New Zealand First are 8.6 versus 6.1 in that election. ACT 7.3 versus 8.6 in that election. The Greens are pretty much even Stevens, 11.8 versus 11.6 in that election. Of course, the One News don't give us the decimal points, so all of this is very rough kind
Thanks
of stuff.
for that, TVNZ. I appreciate it.
Labour up to 31.1 from 26.9. National down to 32.4. Average across those two polls versus an election result of 38.1. What else do you see in this, Annabelle? I mentioned New Zealand First up. One of the interesting things to me is that normally or very often in MMP, since MMP arrived at the midway point, we'd be talking about the parties that were the minor parties that were struggling to get above 5 at this point. Reasonably comfortable when you assume that Te Pāti Māori are highly likely to retain at least one electorate, that those the current 6 parties would be returning in some form at least. We're not talking about whether or not there'll be scrapping by any one of ACT or New Zealand First or the Greens even to get to that 5%. National, though, down in both. What are you seeing in this post-budget, post-pay-equity polling mix?
Very good news for the minor parties. Terrible news for both of the major parties, I think. I think, most people would agree that Varian's probably the superior of the two polls, and that Reid, because it's so online, it kind of skews a bit younger and hipper. But, I mean, if you take that away, the overall message is that if either of these parties want to lead and they can get the undecideds on side, they're still going to have at least two coalition partners to govern, and I do not think that is ideal for either of them.
Yeah.
I think that the risk that ACT face is that they appear to be losing support over to New Zealand First at a critical time, because Winston is now free to, to take pot shots free from the burden of his deputy prime ministership. And the other thing, which is just a matter of
having been so shackled,
having been so
in the first half,
so shackled. The other thing that I would have been very interested to see would have been a poll of the Tamaki electorate, because I think that Brooke Van Velden, part of the reason she won that electorate is because the professional women who lived there saw Simon O'Connor as being very regressive when it came to issues, of women's rights. And so what I've heard from people who live in the electorate is that, they're very disillusioned with the pay equity issue. And I think that could potentially come back to bite her in the next election if National puts up a reasonable candidate.
Interesting. The Verianne One News did poll on the pay equity changes, asking, do you support the changes to the pay equity scheme? I kind of would have thought that there might be a stronger opposition there than there was. They had returned 39% support versus 45% oppose. When you looked at another bit of polling that came out at the end of last week from Talbot Mills, which showed a pretty thudding disapproval rating for the budget as a whole, the numbers on that, which were the worst kind of overall since they started polling in 1996 in terms of perceptions of the budget. Given all of that, Ben, do you think that National might think, oh, well, we haven't been hurt as much as we might have been?
Yeah, look, I think I was on TVNZ at some ungodly hour this morning discussing the Verian poll and confidently pronouncing that this was, great news for National, that they had successfully navigated the pay equity issue. And this is complicated by the arrival of another poll, which suggests maybe a little bit differently. But I would have thought, the pay equity issue is a very clear-cut labour issue. It's probably the most exemplary, I guess, class-based kind of issue in terms of, vulnerable workers versus, you could contrast it with the rich fat cats getting landlord tax breaks or whatever in last year's budget. It's like a big juicy piñata for a social democratic party. And I think the fact that it doesn't really seem to have showed up much at all in either of the polls, certainly nothing sort of cataclysmic, could show one of two things. One, it could show support amongst women was already very low for the government parties, certainly amongst New Zealand First and ACT, but I don't know about, National. I would have thought had a bit of a fall. The other thing that it might show is that I think the issue lost steam pretty quickly. It got diverted into a number of different tributaries, or tributaries flow in. I'm a little confused. That, first we started talking about the C word and civility politics, and then Te Pāti Māori really took centre stage as if they were at the Aotearoa Music Awards with their privileges committee discussion. And so I think it lost a bit of steam heading into the budget. The sad reality is that I think vulnerable workers and people in low-paid, unglamorous positions don't tend to fascinate the media and the public as much as young, articulate professionals, young doctors, nurses, that sort of thing. And I think that Labour, I don't know if they in particular botched it. They didn't sort of help themselves with things like, bringing the Andrea Vance column into the debate in Parliament. But I think they've sort of missed a trick there.
Just briefly on that though, Ben, what we don't see in either of these polls is a breakdown in terms of men versus women. The only one that routinely provides that is the Roy Morgan, which, for all its peccadillos, will be interesting to see on that front. But the two parties that fronted the pay equity changes were the National Party and the ACT Party, unequivocally. New Zealand First stayed as far away from it as they possibly could. In the One News poll, the combined drop for National and ACT is 3 points. in the RNZ read, the combined dropped for National and ACT is 5 points. That's not nothing.
No, sure, no, certainly. But if you were Labour, you would want to see some of that support coming to you. Now,
For sure.
There's a suggestion of that in the Reid Research poll. There's a suggestion that didn't happen in the Varian poll. And I think that presented with that opportunity 3 or 4 weeks down the line, you would probably want to see some evidence of that happening, particularly in this kind of between election period where, now admittedly, people aren't paying as much attention, whereas we're sort of equidistant from elections. This is the period where government support gets a bit soft anyway. But, this should be the period where, uncommitted voters are, if they're thinking about it at all, liable to sort of move around in support. So I think this will be pretty disappointing to Labour. It also throws up the challenges that they have. But as Annabelle said, either of the parties is going to have to rely on their coalition partners to get in. We've seen Peters rule out Chris Hipkins once more. That puts Hipkins on, that puts him in the very crowded motorcar side carriage with Te Pāti Māori.
Yeah.
And that's not looking good right now. I mean, there have been a few, I think Thomas Coughlin wrote a very good column about Labour's frustration with Te Pāti Māori. Aaron Smale actually did a column in The Listener, which I didn't get a lot of attention, talking about, Te Pāti Māori maybe devoting too much of their time to performance rather than actually bothering to learn how Parliament works and taking advantage of the institution. And at the same time, Te Pāti Māori isn't particularly incentivized to change what they're doing because they seem to be rising. They're certainly they've got strong support compared to the election. So
there seems to be some cognizance of that. And in that same Thomas Coughlin column, he talked about John Tamihere, the president of Te Pāti Māori, giving a talk to the Labour caucus, I think, on budget night. And so there seems to be some awareness that they need to try and meld the minds a bit. I
agree, Ben, in terms of Labour bungling the opportunity with the pay equity issue. Some of the first headlines that came out not too long after was that while Labour was criticising it, they wouldn't commit to restoring the full amount of pūtea that had been lost. So I think, not the ideal response at that time. And so I think, a real lost opportunity there for them. But the other thing that it made me wonder is, not a whole lot of movement happening for Labour. We had Hipkins on Mata last week. He was very reluctant to talk about what future policy might be, and it's way too early in the election cycle. And I do wonder if the small target strategy is the right one at this time. I do wonder if perhaps it's worth talking about some of your policy that may be considered somewhat controversial, but to get it out during this section of the election cycle so that it's run out of puff by the time, like capital gains tax, for example, like if you commit to it now, are people still going to be talking about it in 18 months' time? Would it have run out of steam and just be accepted by them?
I think probably the contrary is their concern, is that people will be talking about it too much. They've said that their tax policy will be released by the end of the year. You mentioned the small target strategy. What you saw in the UK in the last election there was that Labour under Keir Starmer adopted what they became called the Ming Vase strategy, which is that you have to conduct the pre-election period as if carrying a Ming vase, and there's all the delicacy that involves, i.e., don't mess things up, don't cock it up and make a mess. And I think that possibly they're going to they're a bit too Ming vase at the moment. Where is the representative in the Labour shadow cabinet, as it were, who's out there leading the charge against these pay equity changes? Who is it?
I feel like Willie Jackson's probably the most dynamic person they have at the moment in terms of really sticking it to the opposition about these sorts of issues. You look to at what happened with the Democrats in the US, and it seems to be that people are just sick of the status quo, so they were prepared to take another punt on Trump. And I do wonder if that's the risk that Labor runs, is that if you're not going to talk about what your vision is and what you're prepared to do, even if it's controversial, are people just going to see you as more of the same?
It's interesting, Stuart Nash was on RNZ this morning and bemoaning the lack of dynamism in both of the major parties, and suggesting that was why, with Winston Peters and Shane Jones, love them or loathe them, at least there's some character there, a bit of personality. And
it's
that
like, what could they bench? 180? Where's the explosive speed? Exactly that. And, take that with a grain of salt if you will. But when you look at the Chris numbers, the combined Chris numbers in these coming back to the polling, boy, they're not great, Like the preferred Prime Minister numbers are what they are. But the one I think that is the most remarkable is the net favourability, which RNZ and Reid polls on. Both Chris's, Hipkins and Luxon, have dropped. Hipkins to a positive 5.1, so that's the people who are favourable minus the people who are not favourable. Christopher Luxon minus 9.8. And you just think, sheesh, like, the sort of murmurs around whether or not people would start, no one's suggesting there is anything like a spill or a coup afoot. Christopher Luxon went to India, did a good job, had a few better months, went into hiding around the pay equity stuff. But, for both of those numbers, for Chris... I think he was just providing space for women's voices.
Yeah.
Particularly his deputy and his women ministers.
Yeah. But, it's not great, is it? It's not great.
No, look, it's bad. Look, we lived in an age of titans. There's those Christians who believe that, back in the time of Noah, everyone was sort of 20 feet tall or something. And and we used to live in a political world inhabited by John Key, Jacinda Ardern, Helen Clark, Michael Cullen, people like that. And, even the Stephen Joyces of the world. Now, look, it's very much down to earth. Now we have the sort of political leaders that you would probably expect from a country the size of New Zealand.
Bring back the political dynamism of Stephen Joyce. Wow, that's where we are. There's nothing wrong with that. They're both capable politicians. Look, Luxon does have, we've talked about it ad nauseum, that he has these structural issues that other prime ministers have not had in terms of his coalition partners and the strictures that puts on him. But look, and there is the issue of, ongoing economic malaise. It's a long, slow climb out of the recession. And because of the fiscal sort of constraints that we've got, we're not in that situation where you can just sort of throw goodies at the electorate and say, here's your reward. And I think, that might go to the polling for the budget, which is that I think, this used to be more common, and excuse my digression into old man stories, but, for the first few elections I voted in, when I came of age in the 1990s, became deputy prime minister of my house by, becoming of age or whatever. It was more common in the 90s, where there were, deficits all the time, high unemployment. There was this sense, rightly or wrongly, that elections were a little bit about kind of taking your medicine, and you were just sort of you were kind of hunkering down and hoping for the least bad option, but you certainly weren't going to the polls thinking, what's in it for me? What's my expected return from either of these parties? And that kind of, the kind of dam broke on that, I think, in about 2005, when it was tax cuts versus student loans versus working for families. And there was just all of this sort of, all of this lard and pork barrel stuff being thrown at the electorate. And honestly, thinking back, I remember feeling giddy. I remember this kind of head rush of going like, going to the calculators and being like, I could really cash in from this election, which is not something I had ever previously thought about elections. And we've kind of been stuck in that mindset, but with sort of diminishing potential returns in terms of tax cuts, or what did Labor have for their cost of living budget, a few years ago, $400 over 3 payments. And
wildly expensive, and nobody really even noticed. And it certainly didn't pay off politically for them. So, the government didn't really have this option of having a budget where they would suddenly write a check and everyone would feel happy. And Labour, because they are, I think, more responsible than, some opposition parties, they certainly say, well, we'd borrow more, we'd do, but they don't go over the top in terms of, we can pay for everything, and so we are in this world where, unfortunately, the government is not giving out presents like Santa Claus, and that's because the government is struggling for money because the economy is slowed, we're not paying enough tax to pay for it, and that means people are cranky, and that means you're not going to be a wild Santa Claus kind of figure anymore. That's sort of the reality, unfortunately.
It will forever be impossible to beat the interest-free student loans policy, eh?
That's right.
No one will ever come up with a banger like that.
Yeah, go to the calculator and they're like, you'll say $40,000.
Incredible.
Labour will hand you a giant check at the ballot box.
I mean, it is looking at the numbers that maybe in some ways the one that matters the most is the level of optimism relating to the economy, and that has improved a bit via the One News Varian poll, where 41% of people think the economy will do better over the next 12 months versus 21% think worse, 38% the same. And, in a number of elections and, various bits of analysis suggest that that's the one metric that matters more than anything. And so there is an argument that Labour and the opposition parties should be doing better now, if ever, and we'll see how that pans out. You mentioned the colossal leaders of the past, Ben, and we've had an interesting 7 days, I suppose, with two former prime ministers taking centre stage. The first being Jim Bolger. Very happy birthday to Jim Bolger, who turned 90, I think, on Saturday. And that there were a couple of interviews, there were a few pieces and reflections. Partly on that first term of reform that he and Ruth Richardson drove through, and then as much as in terms of reflections on what was achieved in terms of treaty settlements and engagement Crown Māori relations. And then we had the release of Jacinda Ardern's book, which I think is called A Different Kind of Power. I've read a few bits and bobs on it. It's good. It's quite a good read. Not great read if you're not really for political wonks though, in that she doesn't really get into it. It's about 340 pages long, and it's only at page 180, so well past the halfway point at which she becomes the leader of the Labour Party. There's a lot about the early life and the Mirapara and Morrinsville years and so on. But I do wonder, partly, we haven't yet seen, Ardern is still floating around the bottom in the preferred prime ministers, but I thought it would be quite, it's kind of, you could imagine Jim Bolger and Jacinda Ardern topping the preferred prime minister rankings for their, in a way it's not great for the National and Labour to have these two revered former leaders, or while they're sort of struggling to look shiny and new and interesting.
Well, Bolger is actually a bit of a role model, I guess, for Luxon, who probably wouldn't see it that way. Bolger, famously the last non-university educated prime minister, probably the last farmer, actual farmer.
Milked a lot of cows. He's milked a lot of cows.
Probably will hold forever the record of most children of any prime minister in New Zealand.
Barbara Edmund, how many has she got?
She's still one behind, so
okay.
She's got time. Yep. But she's got time to become both prime minister and have more children.
Yep.
But she'll have to get cracking on both.
Yep. If Marama Davidson, she's got 6. Marama Fox had 9. So if Marama Fox stages a comeback, she would match him, and if she became prime minister. Sorry, Ben, please continue.
Bolger notoriously, there were periods where his preferred prime minister ratings were in the single digits.
Yeah.
And he was always much more in the sort of Luxon personal ratings than the he was maxing out in the Luxon ratings, but he was Prime Minister for 7 years and has an incredible legacy. He kickstarted the treaty settlements process, he and Doug Graham, which I think is an extraordinary legacy for any politician. A more contested legacy in terms of his reforms in the employment market, and certainly in terms of the mother of all budgets, but also oversaw the Public Finance Act with Richardson, which has sort of helped to avoid those election night surprises that bedeviled both his government and the Labour government before it. So, I mean, and he was also somebody who, was never a hugely magnetic sort of leader, but was a very effective chairman of the board, had the same sort of delegation sort of style that I think Luxon prides himself on. So, look, certainly, I wouldn't think Luxon should bristle at Bolger's reappearance in public life. I think he should take a few lessons.
Although it probably doesn't help when Bolger says stuff like he should tell Seymour to pipe down, sort of thing. That doesn't make you look like you're super nailing the leadership thing. The Ardern thing is interesting because I feel like the red mist of COVID rage is starting to dissipate and lift.
Really?
Yeah, I do. I feel like that there's not as much
not for me
hatred towards her online as what there used to be, or at least people aren't as vocal about it, or seemingly are less triggered by the mere mention of her name, and that could prove to be quite helpful, I think, to Labour, in terms of not being associated, her not being seen as this terrible, dastardly figure in New Zealand politics anymore that people wanted to punish Labour for. Can I just say, did you guys see that Talbot Mills poll about the budget? About the budget?
Yeah, I mentioned it on this podcast a moment ago.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I tuned out.
No, but go on.
I just thought it was interesting that they said that in the it's a record low of budget approval. Obviously, they're the Labour pollsters since they started keeping polls on it. Yeah.
That's interesting. Quickly before we go,
did you say that bit? Was that the bit you talked about?
I think that might have been.
Did you say exactly that?
I don't know. Probably I didn't. Probably
are you gaslighting me?
I don't know. We have to go back and listen back. See, I hear you can edit it out.
Edit out his bit and just go with my bit because my bit's clearly superior.
No. We run this equally, right?
You know why I didn't hear it? Because I was actually Googling it.
Toby gets the first half of the podcast to talk about the Talbot Mills poll.
Yes, yeah.
And then he hands over in a just and peaceful fashion to Annabelle to talk about the Talbot Mills polling on the budget for the second half of the podcast.
And then he starts criticising my commentary of the Talbot Mills budget, which I think is probably what we might see.
But you're now freed up to say whatever you like about anything, and you can criticise Ben, our leader, more than you might otherwise. Quickly before we go, the Aotearoa Music Awards last week, I was there.
Were you?
And when Stan Walker gave his performance, it was incredible, and then the aisles sort of flooded with a bunch of people in Toiti Tiriti flags, and the whole thing was quite impressive. One of the people I was there with said, gee, if Te Pāti Māori could really harness this energy, they could do even better in the next election. There is this, keeping that going and then as it happened, perhaps Chris Bishop was having the same thought, and he achieved, the great disgrace, the greatest imaginable disgrace, as I think Hayden Donnell has considered in a recent post on the spin-off, being called a dickhead by Don McGlashan. I think, what did Chris Bishop say? He said, what did he say?
Well, when I listened to the video, I thought I could hear him complaining about it being performative.
He said, this is crap. He said it was performative something or other.
I'm like, you do realise it's a performance, right? Like it's an actual show where people perform. You would expect a level of...
He felt it had been politicised, was his explanation afterwards. And it, it's an interesting perspective, I suppose. I think he's acknowledged that it was a pretty dumb thing to do, maybe even a dickhead move to sort of say that during the course of the event. The thing about Bishop in a way is that he's genuinely a music fan, and there is something to be admired about the fact that he, despite the fact that the fan bases and most of the bands do not love the National Party, he continues attending and being an enthusiast. But that Don McGlashan was kind of right, wasn't he, Ben?
Oh yeah. Look, on the video, you're sort of like, it is rude. And I think again, like you said, I think he's sort of acknowledged that without saying in as many words, and said, I should have just kept it to myself. I think the disjunct, I think, probably comes from, Toi to Tiriti. He would see that as a sort of partisan Te Pāti Māori sort of movement / organisation, which is, I think, basically factually correct in terms of its sort of genesis and its leadership. But I don't think that that's how the wider public sees it.
I don't think it is.
That's how anyone would have seen it. Is the incorporated in Stan Walker's performance.
Yep.
That if you've seen the video for the song, incredibly shot piece up in Te Uruwera with Tamaiti. It's all about standing in his Māoriness, standing in his tūhoitanga. It was totally of a piece. I mean, I just saw it afterwards, after the controversy erupted. I went and looked at the performance. Fantastic performance. Look, in the same way that I think, Bishop was probably having a bit of PTSD from the Māori Party privileges debate and all of the hassle there.
He should have referred Stan Walker to the Privileges Committee.
That's a really good call. Maybe they could write a list of when it's appropriate for Māori to wave flags and do haka. That would be super helpful. But who of us hasn't said something dicky when we've got a couple of beers on board? I get that bit, fine, whatever. But what's stupid about it is that National voted against the treaty principles bill. So why are you repositioning yourself to be hard done by the opposition to the treaty principles bill? It's like, bro, own goal much. And then you got dissed by Fur Patrol too. I was like, far out, tough.
He was wearing a Fur Patrol T-shirt, to be clear.
That's right.
I spoke to him briefly afterwards, and he didn't seem drunk to me, to be clear, and I completely missed the scoop. Being useless, but he was just absolutely gushing about how much he loved Fur Patrol and going to see them in the hut, and how they played the classic deep cuts and sort of banging on like a middle-aged bore about B-sides.
Julia Deans put up what I thought was a very gracious
I thought so
kind of Facebook post.
Yeah,
I thought so too.
Sort of making room for everyone to be called in to the conversation. And I thought she and Fur Patrol as an institution dealt with the issue well.
Also, there was if you watch if you read the pieces I did before I watched the video, it seemed like Don McGlashan, beloved New Zealand rock star, had gone up, stood up, and given him a dressing down. He'd really given it to him. You listen to the video, he's kind of like. He's sort of politely inquiring, "What are you doing, mate? Why are you being a dickhead?" It's so beautifully New Zealand. I love that.
Yeah. If you read about the rant and then being confronted by Don McGlashan, you would be quite surprised
pretty
to see
polite.
the extremely New Zealand scene playing out of a guy saying something just loud enough so he hopes somebody might hear, and then somebody going like, "Oh, could you just sit down?" But look, this is the thing. Just as Te Pāti Māori should observe tikanga in the House of Representatives, the centre-right politicians know the tikanga when they go to the New Zealand Music Awards. I think no harm, no foul. I think that a telling off from Fur Patrol is more punishment than anyone else will ever be able to give.
And with that, we say farewell to you. Back soon. Lots of love. Bye.
Anchor me in the middle of your deep blue sea. Anchor me, anchor
Hello, I'm Dungeon Master Paddy Carroll, and this is Fury of the Small, a limited series Dungeons & Dragons podcast produced by the Wild Magic Tavern in partnership with The Spin-Off. Part radio drama, part adventure novel, and part improv comedy, Fury of the Small is full to the brim of epic moments, big laughs, and unexpected twists. Fury of the Small, available now wherever you get your podcasts.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.